right, everyone, welcome. My name is Charlie Crocker. I'm a Senior Vice President here at Genasys. And today we're going to talk about emergency event pre-planning with a big focus on the atmospheric river flooding and multi-hazard evacuation and warning events that have happened in Northern California. We want to give you an opportunity to hear from Tony Blackman, a battalion chief from San Mateo County Consolidated. They were very engaged in the atmospheric river and had a lot of really good learnings and use cases. And then we also have Nick Baldrige with us. He is a lieutenant at the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office, and he's going to walk us through a lot of the details in Santa Cruz County, where there was a lot of damage and a lot of simultaneous events happening. Before we dive into the conversation, though, I'd like to give you a little bit of context for what Genasys provides and how it has been supporting folks like Tony and Nick in the field. So for evacuations right now, the current process tends to be incredibly slow and error-prone. Often evacuations are planned after the event happens, so they're very ad hoc. We guess the fire's path, we figure out where we want to evacuate people, even though in many cases we may have information prior to the event. And once we make the decision on where we want to evacuate, it's difficult to understand the real-time implications on traffic, the number of people that could be affected, potentially even the number of structures. So how do we make it easy for multi-agency folks to get together and do the decision-making? That can be one of the hard parts of the evacuation process as well. And then getting information to the public. Information can be spotty, it can be unclear. The evacuation instructions can sometimes be very difficult to understand. Here's an example of some communication silos that have happened. The map on the left is from a large fire, the Dixie Fire, that happened about a year and a half ago. This is one map showing evacuations on the right-hand side of the map, the eastern side of the map. On this other map, put out by a different agency, there's a big gap where those evacuations are. So if you happen to work in one county and live in an adjacent county, you end up having to go to multiple sources to be able to understand where to go and what the information is. So how do we reduce these communication silos? And during this event, there were folks that were posting on social media that having separate evacuation maps across counties was creating a large amount of confusion. So we've seen this in real time, and we've worked with these agencies to make this a much better process. And once you've made that decision and you want to get that information out to the communities and to the media and potentially to other agencies through a variety of different sources, that can be very difficult. People get conflicting or untimely communications. We're seeing a lot of new sites coming up that are scraping radio information and web information and trying to post information before the agencies even put out an alert. So how can you really shorten that time frame to get the information out quickly from an authoritative source to the places where people go to get their information? Sometimes we think about just getting the information out through our mass notification system, but there are a lot of other places that the community and other agencies go to get their information. Time is of the essence. We want to shorten the time frame it takes to make a decision and to communicate that decision. So in order to do that, we need to provide effective communication between both the agencies and the first responders on the ground doing the work. We want to be able to provide the people making the decisions on who's going to evacuate and where they're going to go. We want to provide them with tools to make quick, data-driven decisions. And then ultimately, we've got to get that information out. We have to communicate that and have people know that it's from an authoritative source, whether it's for residents and businesses, which tend to be easier because they're in your region. But then there's also non-residents that may be visiting the area. There may be vulnerable populations like homeless encampments and others. There may be volunteers or mutual aid partners coming in to support you. And then there's areas that may not have cell coverage or Wi-Fi. So how do we make sure we get that communication out to all corners of the community? So we're going to talk today with Nick and Tony about the unprecedented flooding that happened in California starting at the very bitter end of 2022 and going to 2023. During this time, we saw multiple events happening simultaneously in single counties and in multiple counties. We saw river flooding, urban flooding, storm surges, mudslides, winter storm warnings, power outages, trees down, and we had the first time ever used on the application in the last month, avalanche warnings up in the Sierra, specific small areas and then regional advisories as well. So I want to, just before we bring Tony and Nick on in just a minute, show you some of the images from the recent atmospheric river in California. This is Capitola, where and in Santa Cruz County, where 2 piers were destroyed. This is the Capitola Pier with the storm surge. This led to storm surge evacuations as well as many road closures. This is Highway 17, a major artery between Santa Cruz and Santa Clara County. And this was closed multiple times. This is just one of the mudslides that happened. This is in San Mateo County, an area going underneath the Caltrain railroad track, where there was some severe flooding. That car parked there actually had a person in it that needed to be extracted. And then here is just one of many mudslides that we've seen in Alameda County. This is one of the bigger ones, shutting down areas in Castro Valley. And then finally, in this picture, you see Highway 17. The summit of Highway 17 is less than 2,000 feet in elevation, and it was closed, really unprecedented for snow. So this was a big deal. This is once again a major artery, a major commute line that had to be shut down due to snow activity. So I'm going to invite Tony and Nick to turn on their video, and welcome, gentlemen. Really excited and honored to have you here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. Happy to be here.
Good. I'm going to stop sharing for a sec here so that we can, whoops, stop share so I can see a bigger view of you guys. There we go. All right. We've been talking about this for a while, you know, offline here. So we've got a couple different kind of lines of tack we can go here. So after seeing all the pictures for everyone online, what were some of the key aspects, critical events, or related emergencies that you guys had to deal with during the recent atmospheric river? And maybe Nick, we can start with you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so for the atmospheric river, I mean, it was come up with whatever ideas you could come up with, and it seems like we faced it during that storm system. Our waterways, our tributaries that go to the major rivers, were not really designed for the level of water that we saw. So we had flooding from the north part of the county all the way to the south. We had 4 different waterways that flooded every single weather event that we had during that 16-day span. In addition, in the middle of that, because of the high winds that storm created, it created a tidal surge that then impacted our entire coastline and damaged a number of houses and roadways along that area. Mudslides throughout, trees down, power outages, you name it, we pretty much came up with it during that. And then to throw some snow in the last week,
right?
I think we got the full gamut of everything.
And this was not just happening in one location in the county.
No, it was across the entire county.
Right. So shoreline, residential areas, and in the rural communities.
Correct.
Yeah. Tony, what were you guys experiencing? What were some of the big events you had to deal with?
Well, San Mateo County, just north of Santa Cruz County, very similar. We're a peninsula. So on one side, we have the San Francisco Bay. On the other side, we have the ocean. And what we had is we had a lot of wind, a lot of rain, everything came in at once. And all these small tributaries were flooding. And same thing with the king tides that we experienced at the same time of everything else come on. We had king tides. So very high tides, which makes it difficult for a lot of our bayside to drain. So we had very predictable places that we expected some flooding, like you showed the intersection. And a lot of those are based on the floods will not happen if everything's working the right way. In other words, all the pumps are pumping the water out and things are working in that nature. But they throw in the high winds, trees down, power lines going down, pumps going down, and things going on. So we had many incidents happening at once. And the Emergency Operations Center for the county was, of course, opened up, as well as department operating centers and emergency operating centers for the 20 different cities in the county were up and running. And like you said, there was just one after another. One thing just kept hitting and the next thing. So we had some major thoroughfares that go east to west in our county that were completely shut down early on in the event. We had a lot of small rural areas with trees coming down and isolated certain communities that only have one way in, one way out. So not a large impact in terms of population, but completely isolated. And then we go over to the Bay side where we have a lot of the major part of our population flooding and such around hospitals and other critical infrastructure. So a lot of things happening at once. And it just felt like it was almost a test of our system to see how much we can handle at once. So
Right.
very busy couple of weeks.
So you guys have had the, unenviable experience of having to also deal with large wildfires. I know the CZU complex fire a couple of years ago, and I'm not sure if you have participated in any of the other fires in California on a mutual aid perspective. But how is it? How was this different? Like, how do you deal with what's the approach? How's the approach different from for this type of extreme flooding and regional versus a fire? Maybe you can start, Tony.
So for the fire point of view, yeah, obviously California, lots of wildland fires. A lot of them are driven by the wind or driven by topography. We have a good sense of when they start, where they're going to go, how they're going to go. A little different here is it wasn't just a one start, one place of origin and spreading from there. It was hitting all around our county. It was hitting the county, San Francisco to the north, Santa Cruz and Santa Clara counties to the south. So it was impacting everybody, huge region-wide impacts. So it really had a lot more happening at once than we were used to. And just to put things into perspective, this was the third wettest storm that we've had in our San Mateo County's history. So this was one of the biggest ones that's hit us ever. So it was a lot happening at once, and it's just not something that we were used to, especially coming out of a 10-year drought.
Right.
We weren't really geared up for these kinds of floods, so to speak. A lot of people who were here in the past, it hasn't snowed here in 50 years. So people weren't ready. People who were working there then aren't here now. So a lot of new players who've done these things in philosophy, not in real life. But yeah, so a lot of the things that were the same is we did have a lot of communications that we're trying to, always a communication game, right? Trying to make sure everybody knows where the threats are, where the roads are closed, what we're trying to do, which roads are open for the public, which ones are open for first responders and such. So some similarities, but a lot of differences at the same time.
Right. Nick, anything to add with kind of the difference between your approach to wildfire versus the atmospheric river event?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those where, yeah, we were getting information. It was happening faster than we were able to respond to a lot of it. I mean, we were watching the river gauges and they were jumping 2, 3, 4 feet in an hour in some of our tributaries that they were faster than we could move. And so kind of like a kickoff to a fire where you're in that scramble mode. It seemed like every single time we got the rain, we were in a little bit of scramble mode because the water was cooling up faster than we were anticipating. And so it took a lot of pre-planning for the future events after the main New Year's flood was where we really kind of had to scramble. And then following that, it got a little bit better.
So based on that, that's a great segue. You mentioned pre-planning. So what sort of pre-planning did you do like in long-term advance? And then what sort of pre-planning did you do like 1 day or 2 days before you knew an event was going to happen? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so we started off the New Year's Eve start of this atmospheric river was one of those, again, scramble mode. We weren't expecting the level of flooding that we saw. And so coming out of that, it was how do we plan for the rest of this event as it's expected to be prolonged? And so we used, it was one of those, what did we have to use? And we used Zonehaven to do it, identifying all those zones that are in those flood areas. And so we pre-scripted messaging for flooding, for mudslides. It was one of those, come up with the different options that you had that we could potentially be looking at and find a script so that we could easily plug and play that when we need to send those notifications out. So following that storm, we were meeting with all the local stakeholders on a daily basis, planning for that. But I was tasked with scripting out all the evacuation orders, and it was one of those. In the time, that's what we had as the best resource to use was utilizing the zones to push that out for information wise. For part
Excuse
of it,
me,
it
real
was-
quick, for those on the phone that might not know what the zones are, or can you describe what you mean by the zones?
Yeah, so ultimately, when we adopted Zone Haven right around the time of the CZU fire, each areas, the fire districts were broken up into identified zones within that fire district. And so each fire district may have 10 to 30, 40, 50 independent zones. So it's small pockets that you can identify as areas of threat. And most of those were designed around fire response. And so following CZU, our San Lorenzo Valley that was around the CZU burn scar, we started identifying areas of potential debris flow. So we broke down the bigger zones into even smaller zones that were specific towards debris flow. A lot of that still maintained and is still in place today, which helped us for the flood zones when it came to the San Lorenzo Valley. The rest of our county was very fire or generally based zones. So we had one zone that was in our Soquel area where there was one road that we were concerned about impacted by flooding, but it was something like 20,000 residents in this zone because it was a very large zone. So a lot of that has to do with, at the time, it was kind of square peg, round hole. I just had a big hammer and I made it work. But it's going back now and redeveloping those zones to be more of a flood threat zones and adding those in so that when we have another event like this, we can target that specific audience, because at some points we are over evacuating. So we were putting an evacuation order out to one road in a zone because that's a tool we had at the time. And two of our hospitals were well above flood stage, but we're within those zones. And so we were fielding phone calls regularly about whether they had to evacuate.
So you have the opportunity then to kind of with the tool to continuously learn and continuously adapt, right? So as we move forward, your pre-planning is going to become more precise and add additional hazard.
Yeah, and it's learning from those things to make those changes so that we're prepared for pretty much anything thrown at us. And so it's one of those, we could have probably developed it a little bit more early on, but we had what we had and we made it work for this time being. But yeah, it's going back and actually making it work for us because it's there to work for us. It's just whether or not we had it in place at the time.
Right. Tony, any thoughts on sort of how you guys do or did pre-planning?
Yes, a lot of the same things that I did in Santa Cruz, and we did a lot of pre-planning on how our messaging. In San Mateo County, many different languages are spoken in San Mateo County. So we scripted some messages and try to translate them the best we can we actually had people in our EOC who spoke multiple languages. So it wasn't just as simple as doing a Google Translate, but actually people who speak that language, getting them in there. So they became a cut and paste type of situation as we needed to. As I was saying, with this county, large mountain in the middle, bay on one side, ocean on the other, smallest water came in, all these tributaries were flooding. And to give you an example, using one of them, in the middle of the mountain range there, we have San Francisco's watershed, really a lot of water, drinking water for San Francisco. So 3 large reservoirs. One of them came within less than a foot of coming over the spillway. It was being monitored all the time. So a lot of conversations with our partners to the north and what would look like if it started to spill and come over the top. Only so much water can be released at a time based on the tides, right? High tide, you release too much water, you flood. So we're waiting for low tides. They were doing a fantastic job keeping everything going. But what we did is we came out as an example and just used this tool Zone Haven, and which split unincorporated county and 2 different cities, city of Hillsborough, city of San Mateo, and split the zones up. Very, very high density population in that area. So we didn't want to take the zones, complete large zones that we're talking about, and put them all into an advisory warning. So what we did is we split them up, and we split them based on looking at the topography of the area and the impact. And it's with that one creek, for example, we had many meetings to go along with what we would do if, and there were hospitals in there were senior living places in there, single family residents, mansions. There was all kinds of different places in there. So we really had to try to look at that and pre-plan what would we do if the flooding hit, a certain stage, if it went a little bit higher, and each one of those things, so just to have those contingency plans in place. So fortunately, it never came over to spillway. It came right within inches and stayed there for weeks on end. But what we did is we had everything in place just in case. Lots of meetings with a lot of different stakeholders, and we got ourselves through it. But I think it gave a lot of people a sign of relief knowing that, hey, if we need to, all we have to do is just click, make the notifications, and start the process. It wasn't hairs on fire scrambling type of situation. It was something we could just do on the front side.
Right. So for both of you, having the zones in place, in some cases, using the tool to split the zones in preparation, even if they weren't going to be done, you pre-did that, and then having the road closures, shelters pre-planned, and then also the pre-messaging. So the thing that I'm impressed with is just the fact that you're able to continually iterate. Like, we don't know everything, and so you're able to, take this tool to the field, use it, and then come back and say, hey, we learned something. Let's adapt. Let's continuously adapt. Let's continuously learn and make this better next time. I think that's amazing. So in the heat of the moment, trees are coming down, mudslides are activating. How did Zonehaven itself help you manage the emergency better? Maybe we'll start with Tony.
So I was assigned to the EOC at the county level. And one of the things is, if anybody's worked in an EOC, Emergency Operations Center, it's an information game, trying to figure out all the information and tabulate it. So we have many large screens up on the wall. Zonehaven was put up on the screen early on, and it was an easy way for us to track the threats, track which zones were changed. To give it an idea, our county has about 400 zones. Pretty early on, we had 57 zones highlighted in the advisory level. And what that did is it just took and calculated out for us exactly how many residents we're looking at. So people who are not typical first responders that are in the Emergency Operations Center are starting to look at that and say, hey, we have X number. So early on, to give you an idea, we had 20,200 folks that were threatened of possibly being displaced from their houses, 160,000 acres. And that was 11,807 structures. So that just gave everybody just a quick snapshot of, this is what we're looking at. So if we need to open up emergency operations centers, temporary evacuation points, we know what kind of numbers we're looking at, what's going to happen. And as the weather progressed, with everybody in the room having the same information, we could add zones or take away zones and change things, and we can see exactly in real time what we're looking at. It's very quick to do that. But another thing that we came up with too, that we were using Zonehaven for, is tracking all those road closures. So that came from the director, the county executive, wanted a single place to track all the road closures. And again, two kinds of road closures, right? One road closures for the public, and one might be for public safety. So very useful that we would track whichever roads that were closed. We knew certain areas were going to have bigger concerns, so we kind of pre-planned where those traffic control points were going to be, and a little easier to just click and activate. But what we did is we set up an entire table with deputy sheriffs, and we had the deputy sheriffs basically is fielding phone calls, fielding emails, covered the communications that were coming in, and closing those roads down. And what it did is it really helped, because if some of these major thoroughfares were closed and we had to send a first responder, it changed the dispatch of what that would look like. So everybody could take a look at this. Law enforcement could see it, our dispatchers can see it, fire can see it. And one of the things, an unintentional thing that popped up for us that just worked well, is PG&E, our utilities companies, able to see it, because they're sending all these different vehicles out trying to get the power lines up and get things up and going. They were able to see in real time which roads were open and closed, because again, it might be closed for the public, but not closed for first responders. So very helpful in those regards.
Nick, any input?
No, I mean, ours came through our GIS. They pushed out a lot of the road closure stuff. And yeah, having that information on there and being able to identify the specific zones that were impacted. The pre-messaging, we did We had a few areas that we had already predicted were going to be cut off. They're one way in, one way out type of locations. And so we pre-messaged a lot of that out before the storm came. And then when it did come, they were cut out by trees down, mudslides, all that type of stuff. So we were able to get people the information they needed to either prepare themselves to be kind of cut off for a day or two, or to get themselves out to a better location.
Right. So speaking of people, like the community is very, you're ultimately trying to get this information out to the community. How aware is the community of their zones? And, have you had any response in terms of like usage or, going to the aware site, going and seeing the community version of the application?
We pushed it a lot during the CZU fire about people knowing their zones, and our community is pretty well versed in that, especially in the San Lorenzo Valley. Southern part of the county, not as much, but we were getting it out to people. All of our social media posts all linked them back to the Zone Haven aware site so that they could go and figure out what zone they're in, and we were messaging everything that way. We even had one event where we were doing notifications. I think we were putting zones into evacuation order during one of the storms, and I was watching the local news as I was pushing the information out, and their ticker on the bottom was updating with the zones. So we worked well with our local news to make sure that got pushed out, and then we used social media as a secondary push out point of information.
Tony, what have you guys done much with kind of community engagement, and have you seen or heard any anecdotes on the use?
Yeah, we certainly have. So we've had different jurisdictions, like I mentioned, 20 different cities plus unincorporated area. We let each local agency kind of do their own public awareness campaigns, and so a lot of people are very aware of it. Some people, learning about it as they go, but it seems to be very easy. One of the things I wanted to point out is normally when in a situation like any given Saturday, we run about 400 calls come through our dispatch center in a given day. That first day of the storm, the very tail end of 2023, we had almost 1,500 calls that day. So imagine that many calls coming in, and a lot of those calls were just people asking questions. Do I need to leave? Do I need to change where I'm at right now? And one of the things we had for our dispatch center is they had the Zone Haven up right there, and they could just either refer people to that site, or if they didn't have internet, they didn't have the ability to do it, just, hey, what's your address? They type it in real quick, know where their zone was at, and can give them an explanation and say, hey, you're in a area you need to leave or not leave. So it was one of those things where if the public was not aware of it, they could have figured it out really fast, very intuitive. And then so also for those.
They were able, your dispatch was able to clear calls even more quickly because they could just enter in an address.
They did. They were able to just clear the calls. Yeah. And then we had, then later on, we opened up a 211 line, a separate line for people to call in for information. And then we taught that group pretty quick how to do that. I mean, within moments, it didn't take much at all to show them how to use it. So absolutely, just trying to keep the dispatchers focused on doing their emergency dispatching.
Yeah, well, I've got a little story. My son is in Santa Cruz, and he's in one of the low-lying areas. And so he was in a zone that went under an evacuation warning, and he had many friends, and he's in his early 20s. He had many friends who were sending him links and or images of the zones, telling him that he might have to actually leave. So we saw it on the ground that it was, it was happening, and it was pretty effective. So I was excited to see that. So let's see let's go one more question here. Let's see. What are the key aspects of sort of this? So, we're talking today about Genasys Protect, the Zone Haven platform, which is the evacuation management portion of Genasys Protect. And I'd love to understand from you, like, just kind of in closing, what did you find most useful, sort of either before, during, or after the event, and let's start with you, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those things where the information that we had and the visualization of it, being able to visualize where those zones were, the impacted areas for the pre-scripting, it was easy for us to identify the locations and how we're going to push that to our dispatch center to send out through code red for the reverse 911 notifications. they have access to the same platform. They have the polygons pre-scripted in their Code Red platform. And so being able to kind of pre-plan post that first New Year's flood, pre-plan everything coming out of that. It was very seamless to update Zonehaven, send it out via Code Red, social media. Everything was pre-scripted, so it was just a couple clicks of the button of the keyboard, and we were going. So it was very good to have that as an option.
Tony, what about you?
One of the things that worked well for us is I was talking about, we were tracking all the road closures in the county. And a lot of different roads were closing and opening and very quickly. So what we did is we reached out to all of our partner agencies, like I said, the 20 different cities and entities, and had them adding and subtracting road closures as they went, including, Caltrans, the major freeways going through. At one point, even the one train that comes through the jurisdiction, trees went across the track. So we were able to keep track of that, but not just a single person or a group of people. We kind of outsourced that to everybody in the county. That was all the first responders were adding and taking those things away. So that was a big help for us. I was just going to answer the other question I mentioned on splitting the zones, and I think was a question in the chat. Avinta was asking, how did that help? And I think I just wanted to mention on that, some of the zones are very large and have some complex pieces in those zones. They may have a hospital, a school, and a lot of other different type of things in there. And if the area of concern, say the creek was going to overflood and it wasn't part of the hospital, it wasn't part of the school, we split the zone just to identify which houses or which apartment buildings would be affected. So we wouldn't have to then have all the concerns and issues of trying to evacuate on an entire hospital or a school, which is a much bigger lift for us. So
right. So if it's flood related and it's only going to be a portion of the zone, you can temporarily split it for this activity. And then if it turns out to be a large scale hazardous materials release or a wildfire, you can use the larger zone to evacuate everyone, including the hospital.
Absolutely. And kind of what I was saying is we had those zones split. So, if the flood was only going to be a certain level, we just used the part of that zone. If we thought it was going to get bigger, then we just, we can click and add multiple zones to it. So it just gave us an ability to kind of fine tune the areas of concern for us.
Right. And I want to reiterate something you'd said. So Avnita's asked, is the solution easy for your staff to learn? And you'd said that the 211 folks and others, it was pretty quick. Did it? I mean, what was it? Hours, minutes?
Yeah, so there are two parts. One part was just checking to see if people's current address was in an area of concern. Less than a minute to teach that, how to use that part of it. When we got into splitting the zones or adding road closures, maybe 4 or 5 minutes of a little demo and showing people how to do that part of it. So pretty intuitive. Nothing took a tremendous amount of time. Just in time training worked out just fine in this case.
That's amazing. That's great. So what we've talked to Nick and Tony about today is the use of what we call the Genasys Protect platform. The Genasys Protect platform is made up of mass notification, evacuation management using Zonehaven, and our outdoor long-range speaker system. So all of these things integrating together. We're able to support pre-planning and advanced decision-making, coordinate responses across multiple jurisdictions. One of the key things you heard today is the ability to alert through multiple channels. And then we also can talk about the outdoor systems as well, where you can go to areas where there is no Wi-Fi, no cellular connection. And then to make data-driven decisions, to be able to model your event, to look at the structure of the event, understand the impacts on the populations, and to really look at real-time data feeds of traffic, fire, or flooding type information. So I'm going to show a couple screenshots here real quick. Here's an example of a flood map inside the Zonehaven application. This is a dam break. This is a potential dam inundation. Can show you how you can see which zones would be affected and potentially where you might want to create subzones, or in the future, like Santa Cruz is going to do, permanent flood type zones. And here's an example of a surge zone in Florida. So this is looking at both small zones for evacuation, but understanding how they work across the entire region when you're dealing with low-lying areas that have a potential for flooding. So I really want to thank Nick and Tony for their time, for their dedication to the product, and for their continuous support of Genasys. We work closely with them. We've learned a lot, and we continue to add new items to the application based on their feedback. And we really love to partner with our customers. So Sam is going to put in the chat a link to a case study that you can look at. It's a 2-page PDF that talks about the atmospheric river and some of the activities that happened and the learning. And she'll also put in a link that will allow you to book a demo. But you can also reach out to Ian O'Driscoll here at Genasys if you want to just do that directly, and he can help you schedule or set up a demonstration as well. So once again, Nick and Tony, thanks for your time. Look forward to working with you more and coming in and seeing you guys in Northern California real soon.
All right. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Take care.